Welcome everybody, I'm your host KTB. We're going to do something slightly different this time and take a look at some of the sort of geek/nerd culture in cinema and TV. Many much beloved years-long series are coming to a close in 2019. Avengers, Game of Thrones and Star Wars are all finishing their current run of films or TV. In their quest to tie off plot lines, end momentous stories and finalise long-running sagas, they are trying with varying degrees of success to finish on a satisfying high. It is my view that the ends of these tales have largely been average to disappointing, and that we live in an era of bad endings. In this video I'd like to take a short look at some of the possible reasons why. The best of these has managed on average ending, Avengers, and the worst, Star Wars, has managed to destroy the story before it is even concluded. Game of Thrones falls somewhere in the middle. This video will contain plot spoilers for all of these shows and movies, so if you haven't seen them, please beware. This is not a review of these films or series and will therefore simply explore one or two points related to the issue of bad endings. There are macro and micro reasons why a story may feel unsatisfying when it ends, and these have affected Avengers, Game of Thrones and Star Wars in different ways. And to note, it is hard to end anything of long-running importance, particularly beloved series. After all, as the saying goes, things don't end well or they wouldn't end. So a degree of sadness or nostalgia is inevitable in the closure of great stories, but it can be with happiness and fulfillment that we walk away. I do not believe that that is so in this case. First, Avengers Endgame. Endgame was a good film. It did well to change its characters in ways that were novel and interesting, and to include so many different threads whilst offering such fan service is truly remarkable. Kudos is due to the writing there. However, whilst it was a solid film, it was an average to poor ending for the series. I left the theatre feeling slightly down or disappointed, and I couldn't figure out why. After some consideration, I think the reasons are thus. First, the introduction of time travel immediately reduces the stakes for everyone involved. The moment you introduce time travel into the Marvel Universe, all things can be changed or reversed. Alternate timelines are open for exploration, and fundamentally, death no longer means death. If, for example, you wanted to reintroduce Iron Man into the timeline, you could simply travel back to moments before he is killed, change his ending, and return him to the present. Heck, if you simply want to spend time with a character, as Iron Man does with his father, you can just go back and visit them. This is a macro issue. When death no longer means death, then all stakes are lowered and the risk posed to our characters are removed. This is true of almost anything that includes time travel as a means of telling a story. Secondly, on the macro level in Avengers Endgame, all of these series, Avengers included, have had to begin setting up for their sequels. In the case of Avengers, we have introduced a new cast of heroes while saying goodbye to old ones. This is difficult because the audience is simply not as invested in these characters, and their inclusion, whilst necessary, is at best a distraction and at worst a denigration. Captain Marvel was handled about as well as could be written into Endgame. She was largely absent from the film, which was a positive, and the few scenes she was in were bearable, with the exception again of her macro impact on the plot by virtue of her being far too powerful. Again, we know a lead faces no real risk, will always triumph and can overcome any situation with no real setback, then they remove themselves from our emotional calculation. The final macro reason that many endings in Hollywood are currently failing is politics. Whatever one's political beliefs, when a film is made to include them rather than to reflect them, then the film is compromised. To include politics means to construct narrative around it, to force situations and scenes which allow a point to be made. To reflect politics is merely to allow people to act naturally and for points to be made by indication, implication, or extrapolation. Endgame did well for the most part to keep politics out, but it was impossible toward the end, with, for example, all-female battle groups, Captain Marvel being punched full-on by an Infinity Gauntlet wearing Thanos and not flinching, etc. All of these things are made to include political sentiment and showcase it, not naturally reflect it. As a result, they feel forced and immersion-breaking. However we may feel about these politics, pro or against, we know they are there as scenes for that purpose, and they are therefore crass and unnatural as a result. On a micro level, the conclusion in Avengers Endgame was mildly unsatisfying because the antagonist that had caused all the plot movement was gone. The Thanos our heroes fought was not the Thanos that had gone through every trial and suffered every loss to enact his will. He was a Thanos that had sacrificed nothing and who, whilst he had the same somewhat sympathetic belief about balancing life with resource, simply hadn't suffered to have his goal within his grasp. The Thanos of Infinity War is such a perfect villain because he can be sympathized with. His aim is an evil but understandable bastardization of doing good, and he has suffered personally a great deal to achieve it and isolated himself as someone who has the will to do that which he feels is good and which has, at its heart, the aim of preserving life. The Thanos of Endgame is simply a space tyrant who has suffered nothing and doesn't even hold the same goal anymore. He has become a lesser god to slay. A good and satisfying film with an overall unsatisfying ending to the arc. You'll see this crop up again with other major antagonists. Moving to Game of Thrones Episode 3 Season 8. Technically, like Star Wars, Game of Thrones hasn't yet ended, so why include it for discussion? Because in Episode 3 of Season 8, barring any major plot twists in the final 3 episodes, Game of Thrones did end. Its major narrative was concluded and all the minor characters and narratives are now simply ends to to be tied up. On the macros, much as Avengers lowered the stakes by introducing time travel, Game of Thrones has done two things. The editing and shots of this episode show that when the writers want a character to survive, they simply do, regardless of the odds and what the audience sees. The final pitched battle against the forces of death and annihilation itself is full of cheap camera cutaways, indications of death, only to show an impossible battle outcome later on. The rules of the universe that creates such stakes and have done for 7 years are gone. Much as with time travel, when it is clear a character can survive constantly for reasons of plot, we know that our leads are safe. Second, the overarching narrative of Game of Thrones has now been concluded. The simple battle between life and death. For 8 years, the forces of death and oblivion have been slowly advancing on our bickering characters. They briefly unite or betray one another, but these games don't matter. They are literally games. In the grand scheme of things, death is coming for all and everything, and it is that constant pressure to unite or die that drives every other plot. The frustrations we feel with their scheming and betrayal in the face of oblivion is what matters in uniting people. It is the momentum, the driving force. The Night King is very like the Nothing from the Never-Ending Story. He and his forces are a tide, an unstoppable darkness that simply end life. He has to kill the three-eyed raven because Bran is all human memory and multiple different futures. Bran is the human story. By ending that main plot driver at this point, we leave the remains of the series to simply be cleanup. There is now no more pressure or driver for characters to resolve their disputes by blood or dialogue. It's just a case of plotting and counterplotting to seize the throne. It is equivalent to a drama about Rome, where we care about the politics and the plotting, but all the while a giant barbarian force is being assembled by Hannibal and is at some point going to arrive at the gates of Rome. And if the Romans don't unite, they will die, and their culture will be destroyed. Imagine destroying the barbarian leader and horde halfway through the final season. All that remains a compelling, but far less interesting political plot. The stage is now safe. We are watching actors on it, whereas the Night King would have removed the stage completely. Finally, again, on the macro political level, we are shown that Arya is Captain Marvel. She is an all-powerful, able to adapt to any situation, survive any predicament, and is then allowed to kill the Night King via an impossible plot contrivance that simply is there to offer fan service. There is no consistency, there are no stakes, things happen for the sake of a scene rather than a narrative. Finally, on to Star Wars Episode 9. This will be the briefest of the comments made on bad endings because, much like Game of Thrones, it hasn't yet ended. However, with the massive damage done to the series by The Last Jedi and the indications coming out via the trailers and comments ahead of Star Wars Episode 9, it has ended the meta-narrative. As with time travel, Star Wars has reintroduced characters who were long dead because no one's ever really gone.
No one's ever really gone.
Which immediately destroys the stakes of life and death. Like time travel, if the Force can resurrect anyone, good or evil, then death isn't death and nothing matters. Second, as with Endgame and Game of Thrones, the political aspirations of our writers have inserted themselves, and our invincible, strong female protagonist, once again massively overpowered and without threat to their life, masters anything and looks cool, and we have no investment, sense of growth or other. This has nothing to do with a female lead or female-centered plotline. Women who suffer, fail, and grow are just as interesting as male protagonists. Women whose physical, mental, and emotional weaknesses are tested by well-crafted antagonists are incredibly good characters. Films like Alien, Aliens, and Alien 3 are a testament to the growth and depth of strong female leads. Cinema, like Star Wars and Game of Thrones Season 8, are examples of weak, contrived characters included to showcase a view rather than tell a story. Hugely overpowered and uninteresting protagonists like Captain Marvel and Arya are the same. Perhaps this age of TV and cinema storytelling will come to be studied in future for its reflection of our obsession with identity politics or something else. But to my mind, we have seen an age of excellent storytelling come to a close in an era of bad endings.